So, thank you for coming down or out or up, wherever direction you came from. I'm really pleased to be able to introduce Rob Rupert. Rob is a professor of philosophy and a fellow of the Institute for Cognitive Science at the University of Colorado at Boulder. I'm not sure how long I've known Rob, how many years, but it's many, many years. And so I'm in a good position to tell you that one of the things that distinguishes Rob is that he harbors an extraordinarily high number of false beliefs about the nature of the mind in cognitive science.
There are no
for
beliefs.
which he nevertheless has any number of really interesting, clever, and compelling arguments. In this sort of sense, he's kind of a jobs program for philosophers. So we appreciate it. I'm looking forward to figuring out what's wrong with this view. I'll know it soon enough. Seriously, however, I have been reading and learning from Rob's work for literally decades. And so I am really pleased that he decided to come visit us here. Pleased to have him here with us today and for the next couple of weeks upstairs at the Rotman Institute as a visitor. Please, if this sort of thing is of interest to you, stop by. He's here, or write him a note and make an appointment to chat. You will not regret it. And without further ado, please join me in welcoming Rob Rupert.
Thanks very much, Mike. Thanks for the invitation to visit the Rotman, being such a wonderful host. And thanks to you all for coming out on this beautiful day. Coming in on this beautiful day, I guess is the relevant bit. I'm going to talk to you about the personal level and a psychology flattened from above. And if that doesn't make a whole lot of sense to you right now, I hope it does shortly. So the outline of the talk is that here I'll first explain to you what this personal-subpersonal distinction is all about. It's not, I won't promise you anything very clear. It's made in lots of different ways, but I'll do my best to kind of highlight the main features associated with these two different levels and why they're thought to be two different levels. And then I'll talk about what I think is a prevailing philosophical understanding of cognitive science, a view that I'll disagree with. I'll argue for an alternative. Cognitive science is not out to explain what happens at the personal level. I'll treat it in a kind of more mundane way as an exercise in modeling data, and building theories out of those models. And I'll give you a couple of examples of what I'm on about, maybe that will kind of clarify what the alternative is supposed to look like and why there's not really room for a personal level here. One of these examples will come from cognitive neuroscience, and another will come from the psychology of implicit attitudes. Kind of hot literature. All right, so what is the personal level? The personal level, it's sometimes said, is the realm of entities picked out by literal uses of personal pronouns. So I've sometimes called this the argument from the italicized pronoun. People will say things like, I see the tree. My visual cortex doesn't see the tree, right? And that's supposed to indicate that there's something else that's the subject of the perceptual process. It's the person. It's whatever this personal pronoun refers to. The personal level is often associated with consciousness. It's kind of the realm of conscious beings. It's the realm of agents who act for reasons, of rationally coherent thinkers. So, the idea is that you've got a bunch of beliefs and desires, and when those combine in the right sorts of ways, then you act for reasons. That whole collection of beliefs and desires is thought to be coherent. This is a kind of picture you often get in maybe the Davidsonian tradition about action. I don't know, you're probably just familiar with it from discussions of folk psychology and that kind of thing.
So there aren't any.
Yeah, there's a problem here. There are a number of problems. Consciousness is associated with a perspective or point of view, so this might be a little, that's another way to talk about the importance of consciousness for those who believe in a personal level. But I think it's often the way people talk. And one of the things that I think for many philosophers is distinctive of the personal level and kind of metaphysically distinctive is that it's the realm of normative properties. Right? So in contrast, the subpersonal level is this level of kind of mere mechanism. It's just part of the mechanistic realm, the part that pertains particularly to behavior and action. I'll leave that out. It's the realm of natural law. It's the realm of mere causation. It's the realm of merely descriptive properties. It's, it's what the natural sciences tell us about in the cognitive realm. We think about computational modeling. We think about neural processes. It's just sort of one damn state after another, one cause and effect and a cause and effect. There isn't a thinker in there, right? And thus there's no obligation or ought, no normative properties. A way of seeing the contrast there in terms of normativity. Okay? The examples of alleged personal level phenomena are pretty compelling. I mean, these are certainly ways we talk about whole persons or organisms, the people around us, like that. We say that so-and-so knows English, or is addicted to cocaine, or is in pain. Dan Dennett introduced the language of the personal versus subpersonal, and his initial example was someone being in pain. A historical note from the 60s. X reasons well. X is in love with Y. X is a skilled chess player. X can see the layout of his or her immediate physical environment. Now, I think many of these attributions are true. Things get complicated when you look at any one of them, but I'm not saying, oh, well, that's not true. People don't know languages. People aren't addicted to substances. People don't have pain. I'm not saying that. What we'll try to convince you of is that the behavioral manifestations, we might say, of these states and abilities are not best explained by positing a distinct level. We do want to explain these behavioral manifestations. People who are addicted to substances do things that people who are not addicted to substances don't do. People who reason well arrive at outcomes that people who aren't so good at reasoning don't arrive at, and so on and so forth. So there's tangible, measurable outcomes, and they do need to be explained. I just don't think we need to explain them by positing a separate level. These things are more like summaries of the sorts of patterns that you see in the causes and effects that lead to the behavioral manifestations, as we normally say, of these states and abilities. What they're not, and this is what I'm especially concerned to emphasize, what they're not is a statement of the goal of cognitive science. There's a popular philosophy of cognitive science that looks at this differently. According to this view, personal level phenomena are the primary explananda of cognitive science. And there's a wide range of features of philosophers who think in these terms one way or another. Many of them interested in empirical matters. It may not be a surprise that, say, Jennifer Hornsby thinks there's a distinct personal level and doesn't want to have much to do with cognitive science because she just doesn't think the two can speak to each other at all. Right? We reason sort of a priori about action and the human person, and the scientific realm, they're just playing a different game. Right? But many of the philosophers who make the personal-subpersonal distinction are quite interested in what's happening in the cognitive sciences. Tyler Burge and Jose Luis Bermudez, Susan Hurley emphasize this distinction a lot. So, and the list goes on, and some of it goes back to work you might be familiar with from the kind of functionalist tradition, Rob Cummins, Bill Lycan. I think there were people who talked a lot about homuncular decomposition or functional decomposition. There's a trait of the whole. Any of those ones I had listed on the previous slide, reasons well or is in love or whatever. And then we think of that as being broken down into subcapacities, which are then modeled in more precise ways. And then those are broken down into subcapacities. Right? And explanation is, on this view, vertical in cognitive science. We have this kind of higher level state or ability, and then the cognitive sciences tell us what the nitty-gritty sort of details are that make it possible for that state to exist, that higher level state to exist, or that capacity to be there. So on this view, facts about the personal level, I don't want to say this is Cummins' view. His view is more complicated. But for lots of these folks, and I'll give you some examples in a moment, including Tyler Burge, facts about the personal level are given independent of cognitive science. Our knowledge of them is justified a priori by conceptual analysis, common sense, our knowledge of folk psychology. So we've got these explananda that we know about, and then cognitive science is given a job. Right? The job of cognitive science is to account for these facts, these personal level facts, right? By explaining their mechanistic basis, the subpersonal level. Cognitive scientists simply deliver the engineering details, right, that kind of illuminate matters we already know to be true. Different kind of language gets used here. John McDowell will sometimes talk about enabling, all that sort of nitty-gritty mechanistic engineering kind of stuff enables the appearance of personal level states and capacities, and that sort of thing. Sometimes the term making intelligible, when that description is given. It makes intelligible how there can be these personal level states and capacities. But on the extreme version of this view, no revision is possible. The explananda are already sort of fixed. We know them. And cognitive science is just, if cognitive science said those states didn't exist, then, you know, the way to react on this view is the way many people reacted to the Churchlands when they talked about eliminating folk psychological states. You just sort of roll your eyes and say, oh, well, I know, Burge says this sort of thing, I know a priori that these beliefs and desires exist. And so cognitive science can't tell us otherwise. All right, so I promised you some examples. Here's Burge from his large book, The Origins of Objectivity. He says, the science of perceptual psychology is motivated by the goal of contributing to an explanation of how individuals perceive. More particularly, vision science assumes that individuals have approximately accurate visual perception some of the time, and it tries to contribute to an explanation of how such perception comes about to the extent that it does. And notice, you know, this is an interesting way to characterize the enterprise. It's not that he's saying, you know, we have some intuitions about the kind of skills people have, ways in which they respond to their environment systematically. We're going to start sort of speculating about the causes of these responses, and we're going to do some experiments to collect some data, and we're going to try to model them and see what happens. There's a much more kind of specific vision that he thinks vision scientists have when they embark on the enterprise. And here we get some kind of more heavy-duty philosophical language, but necessarily and constitutively, individuals perceive. Individuals is in italics for Burge in this context. The individual level is the personal level. But necessarily and constitutively, individuals perceive. Perceptual states, as distinct from transformations by which they are formed, are the individuals. Individuals perceive as a result of perceptual states being formed in their perceptual systems. Perceptual states are realizations of individuals' capacities. I think that this claim is a priori. And this isn't a one-off. Toward the end of Burge's book, he makes a long list of the things he's claimed a priori. He's sort of bored about this. He says, this is all the stuff I've claimed a priori. And it's pretty robust stuff. He never quite gives an account of what it is for something to be properly attributable to the person as a whole rather than to one of its subsystems or parts or something like that, or to the mere organism as opposed to the person. He never really gives an account. That's just the language he uses a lot, is to say, you know, this is at the personal level or this is at the individual level because you would properly attribute it to the individual. Now, that's just a placeholder. It's not entirely clear to me how he wants to cash this out, but you definitely have this kind of two-level view. Whereas a term realization occurred in there somewhere, and that's right here toward the end. Perceptual states are realizations of individuals' capacities. This realization talk in philosophy of mind often marks, maybe always marks, a distinction between levels. All right, so Burge is of an older generation of philosophers of mind, but I don't think this kind of talk has gone out of fashion. One of the busier, more interesting, and almost celebrated young philosophers of mind, mid-career philosophers of mind, is a guy named Nicholas Shea. He's done quite well. He's got a new book on mental representation that you should all go read. And he's been deeply involved in the empirical work. And here's a paper in a handbook, Oxford Handbook on Philosophy of Psychology, where he's talking about the way advances in cognitive science might figure into sort of treatment and this kind of thing. So that's the context. And he's talking about some experiments on decision making. This is one of processes that's understood reasonably well. Lots been written about it since the 90s, I guess. Reward systems and how behavior's changed as a result. So the subjects are fully conscious normal adults in the experiments he's been describing, behaving as they do in the experiment because they have understood and are following instructions. Subjects are motivated by the cash rewards available in the experiment, and their behavior shows sensitivity to the structure of those rewards. It's hard to deny that they are acting voluntarily when they select one stimulus over another. And perhaps I should have put, is the seat of free will on that first slide to do with the personal level, because that's something people want to put there as well. So it's hard to deny that they are acting voluntarily when they select one stimulus over another. The thing to be explained, the subject's behavior, is a voluntary action at the personal level. So the temporal difference model, particular way of modeling rewards and responses, the temporal difference model provides a putative subpersonal level information processing explanation of a personal level phenomenon. And this illustrates the standard kind of understanding, a very common understanding of cognitive science's role, right? Explaining the personal level phenomenon by filling in the subpersonal kind of engineering details. Now, I think maybe it's important to distinguish, well, I know it is, and maybe this is the time to do it, between the person and the organism. I've mentioned that kind of in passing a couple of times. I'm not for a second, at no time, during this talk or in Q&A or anything, and I got to deny that organisms are important in cognitive science, right? You got to run subjects, and you got to count your subjects, and you got to be sure to index the behavior of subject 27 in the first trial run, the first trial. You have to be able to index that to that same subject's behavior on the third trial and the seventh trial, right? So it's very important, if you're going to do a within subjects design in your experiment, you got to have the same subject over time. And if you're doing it cross subjects or between subjects, you got to make sure you get your subjects right, so you know when you're going cross subjects and when you're not. So absolutely, we're tracking organisms and their output, right? But that doesn't bring a sort of level of a new level into existence, a level of nature, metaphysical level, like that, right? So, and even just the fact that the organism might have properties that its parts don't have, that's still not enough to bring a kind of new level with sort of new and metaphysically special properties into existence. It might be that I have height, that is, my organism has height. My arm doesn't have height, the way that term is normally used. But that doesn't mean a new level of nature has come into existence, by dint of that fact, right? That my whole body has a property that my arm doesn't have, right? So this isn't just about bigger things and smaller things, although that's sometimes the way we talk. People talk when they talk about the personal, subpersonal. All right, so I want to try to present what I think is a more accurate philosophy of cognitive science, starting with some historical roots. Newell, Shaw, and Simon, in their, this is a 57 paper, 58. Newell, Shaw, and Simon described their project in this way. What questions should a theory of problem solving answer? First, it should predict the performance of a problem solver handling specified tasks. That's what we wanted to do. A little later in the paper, at this level of theorizing, an explanation of an observed behavior of the organism is provided by a program of primitive information processes that generate this behavior. This is the agenda for their human problem solving project. And this doesn't go away, it doesn't disappear from their approach. Newell and Simon explicitly endorsed this picture again in Human Problem Solving, a kind of big project retrospective in Psych Review in 1971. And for those of you not sort of familiar with the program, the kinds of things they were trying to explain were the ability to prove theorems or to play chess, that kind of thing. It's kind of very logically structured cognitive tasks. So what do I think the upshot of this is in contemporary context, right? Well, I think when we're thinking philosophically, as philosophers of science, when you think about cognitive science, we want to keep in mind that respecting the content of independently arrived at claims arrived at by introspection or conceptual analysis or common sense, whatever, about personal level capacities or abilities is not the goal of cognitive science. That's not the sort of measure for success in cognitive science. Rather, the goal is to model observable, measurable, and we hope replicable data. I don't know about the crisis of replication. These data don't appear at a distinct higher level. The data are part of the model of the mechanisms that produce or otherwise account for the data, right? So on a technical notion of a model, that the data and what we think of as the causal processes are just all there together, right, on one level. Right? But this is not to say that we shouldn't be thinking about any of those things I put on the slide on my list of alleged personal level phenomena. Of course, when we're thinking about what sorts of experiments we want to do, what sort of research programs we want to initiate, we're going to be thinking about things like, we may well be thinking about things like the human ability to play chess, or the fact that people are in love with each other, or the fact that people are addicted to substances, or the fact that some people reason more effectively than others, and so on and so forth. Right? All right. So independently arrived at ideas about human capacities may still have a role to play in cognitive science by inspiring experimental design, for example, or guiding researchers through the kind of search space of possible models. Right? So, there are some pretty heavily top-down, what look like top-down research programs are very, active and successful in cognitive science right now. So, Tom Griffiths, for example, is, keen to sort of think at the highest level about what an optimal Bayesian reasoner would do in a given situation, right? And work from there, right? But when he talks about his program and the kind of, when he reflects on methodological principles, this isn't really top-down. It's not top-down in any kind of metaphysical sense. It's not like he's wedded to the idea that they're all perfect reasoners, and that better be preserved as we go, dig more deeply into the engineering details. No, this is going to push us toward what he knows and anticipates to be a kind of messier fact about how humans reason. We're not ideal Bayesian reasoners. But he justifies this approach in the way that I've stuck up here at the end of this item, right? Guiding research through the search space. He just thinks if you start with some kind of conception of what a subject should do if it were a perfect reasoner, that's going to sort of push you to develop certain kinds of models. If you were to instead start just by looking at a bunch of data, it would be hopeless, by just sort of scanning the brain under a bunch of different conditions and trying to find patterns in it. Right? So he just thinks science will progress more quickly if we work top down as a methodological point. And this reflects a framework that many of you may be familiar with, David Marr's kind of tripartite distinction between levels in his account of how cognitive science works or should work. So Marr starts in his famous book Vision. He starts by making the same kind of point that I did just a second ago on Griffith's behalf, that working from the bottom up is going to be a mess. Right? So what we should be doing initially is starting at what Marr calls the computational level and thinking about what sort of input-output function it would be useful for the subject to compute. Right? Maybe it would be useful for the subject to compute a three-dimensional representation of the environment from the 2D stimulus on the retina. Like that seems like a useful thing to do. Now let's go and start constructing some algorithms and seeing whether we can sort of make this work. And then let's look and see whether there are cells that could actually do these things, that have the properties that could compute these functions. Right? And so, but this is all kind of interplay. Right? There's lots of correction. You might think that a subject computes a certain kind of function, but you can't find any machinery in the subject that has those capacities. Right? You can't compute what you don't have the resources to compute. And so, you go back and rethink the problem. Right? So again, there's a kind of top-down methodology, but it's more of a practical matter than the commitment to some other level, facts about which are known independently and that sort of thing. All right, so I wanted to make some role here for the what we think of as kind of folksy or common sense or a prioristic notions about the mind, right? In kind of guiding research, helping us to kind of guess at what research should be done, right? But again, I want to emphasize what they don't do. They don't constrain model selection. Right? It's not standard practice in cognitive science to select otherwise inferior models over otherwise superior ones simply because the former better account for independently arrived at supposed facts about the personal level. That's not what you see happening. It's not as if you've got, a model that doesn't capture much of the variance in the behavioral data or something, and you've got one that does much better by normal kind of statistical standards, right? Oh, but the first model jibes better with what Burge says he knows a priori about vision, so we better embrace that one and throw out the first one. That doesn't seem to be the sort of method of cognitive science. So somebody's wrong here. And the question is whether it's the cognitive scientist or philosophers of mind. And I'm siding with the cognitive scientists. So let me give you an illustration. What I think is a kind of standard paper as illustrates standard practice in cognitive science. Chosen almost at random, but not entirely, because when you look at the title of this paper, you see a bunch of words that many philosophers would associate with the personal level. And so I guess the rhetorical move here is to say, even when you look at a paper in cognitive neuroscience that looks like it might be respecting the personal level or aimed at the personal level, that's not what you see when you dig through the details. So title of the paper, Manipulating the Experienced Onset of Intention After Action Execution. Experience, intention, action, all things that are often associated with the personal level. All right, so say some philosophers would read this as an exploration of personal level phenomena, like action, experience, and intention. But I'm going to try to convince you that the kind of most parsimonious, least convoluted understanding of the model is as an account of the interaction between various same level, subpersonal states that produce the data collected. How many of you are familiar with Benjamin Libet's work on the timing of intention? A few? Smattering of hands? All right. I won't go into too much detail because we'll see the same kind of thing coming out in this paper, but I just wanted to, set the stage a little bit, explain the context in which Lau, Rogers, and Passingham's paper is sort of being offered. So Benjamin Libet did some work in the 80s with colleagues trying to figure out, I'll just give you the splashy upshot. It looked like what he found out was that by the time subjects have formed the intention to move, the process that causes the action, causes the movement, has already been initiated. Right? So activity in pre-supplementary motor area, so-called readiness potential, is already ramping up before the subjects have formed the intention, the conscious intention to act. In which case, it looks like the conscious intention is epiphenomenal, it's just along for the ride. It's actually whatever subconscious process started the process of the readiness potential building up. Whatever process started that is what's really in control. So this hit the headlines. A lot of philosophers were very interested in it. One of the problems with the kind of methodological problems with the research, though, is that Libet and colleagues were trying to get an absolute measure of timing or of the intention, right? So that you think the simplest way to do this is to measure the beginning of activity, the relevant activity in the pre-supplementary motor area, and put a timestamp on that, and then also do something to ask the subject when they formed the conscious intention to move, right? And then you just compare these things. This one happened later or earlier, right? But it's hard to get an absolute measure that is a measure of the time at which the intention actually is formed consciously. And, lots was written about potential confounds and whatnot. So Lau, Rogers, and Passingham took a different approach. They're going to look for alterations in the timing of reports without assuming that the reports are giving you the exact time at which the conscious intention developed. So they're going to see whether transcranial magnetic stimulation, TMS, administered at the time of or just after an action has been executed significantly alters reports on the timing of the conscious intention to act, or estimated timing of the action. There are two conditions. Right? So, and the logic of the experiment may be becoming clear to you, right? If TMS administered at the time of or just after the action is changing the subject's report on the time at which the action happened or the time at which they developed the conscious intention to act, then this is about the conscious intention. That conscious intention isn't fully formed. If you can sort of change the timestamp the subject gives it by doing something that happens after the action, then you think, well, the conscious intention hasn't really fully formed until after the action, in which case it wasn't the cause of the action. So you get the same, in the big picture, the same kind of result Libet got, but without trying to get an absolute measure of the timing of the appearance of the conscious intention. All right. So they did 4 experiments. 3 of them were just to sort of rule out potential confounds or interfering factors. I'll just give you a quick version of the main experiment and the kind of surprising results, and then how they speak to these results. So it's kind of boring, lab kind of stuff, right? Subjects rest their heads on a support. They're going to put their forehead on a cushion support while fixating on a timing device with a dot moving around an analog face. So I'm going to scroll forward. Oops. So you get some idea. So this is the analog face. Right? The dot moves around it very quickly. The cycle is 2.5 seconds, basically. So they're looking at this thing, and they're told to move their left index finger at their whim. Right? So their hand's resting, and they've got its motion is being monitored. So they move their left index finger. You've got an objective timestamp of the time of the movement of the finger. And what the subject's supposed to do is, after the action, the subject's supposed to grab the dot with a mouse held in the right hand and move that dot to the spot where it was when the intention to act was experienced, or at the time of the action itself, depending on the condition. So again, we'll look at this thing. Right? The experimenter initiates the trial. This thing goes around for 1 full, maybe 1.5 cycles, and then after it's done that, then the subject is just, you're free to waggle your left index finger whenever you feel like it, right? While watching this red dot move around the perimeter. After the index finger has been moved, the dot returns to the center, right? And then the subject grabs the dot with the mouse and drags it to where it was at the time the subject experienced the intention to move. Okay. I should have said a bit more about TMS earlier when I first introduced it. Essentially, it kind of scrambles the information in the area that's a target of it. It creates a powerful magnetic field, either, I guess in this case, you'd be hyperpolarizing the neurons, right? And so they all just shut down. And information in the brain is, very simplistically, it's carried by differences, right? And if you just create what people with old TV sets used to call white noise, just, all the information's been lost. There's no systematic difference between, firing rates and different neurons or anything. Right? So some of the subjects were given real TMS over the pre-supplementary motor area at the time of action or 200 milliseconds later. These 2 different conditions. And some of them were given sham TMS. Sham TMS was set up just like the real thing. The machine made its normal loud noise, ka-chunk, when it creates the electric field, magnetic field. And so, the subjects couldn't tell whether they were in the TMS condition or the sham condition. Right? Now, I've already used this, I think, as much as I need to. Probably best to forge ahead, because the results are pretty interesting. They get a significant effect for TMS versus sham TMS. And here are the numbers. The reported timing of the attention was, on average, 9 milliseconds earlier or 16 milliseconds earlier in the TMS condition, depending on whether there was 0 delay or the 200 millisecond delay. But there's not a significant difference between these. Reported timing on the movement was 14 or 9 milliseconds later in the TMS condition, depending on whether there was 0 delay or 200 millisecond delay. And the contrast here is what's supposed to be striking to you. I mean, there are all these maybe other things about the results that you think are cool or interesting. But one thing that's struck me when I first read this paper, I thought there was a typo. I thought, well, it's earlier in the reported timing of the intention is earlier in TMS, but the reported timing of the movement shifts later in the TMS condition. So the effect of the timing of the report of the formation of the intention gets pushed earlier in time. The report on the timing of the movement itself gets pushed forward in time by TMS. Why is this? Right. Well, Lau, Rogers, and Passingham present a they try to model this. It's a bit speculative. They say it's a bit speculative, but it would nicely account for the results. The idea is this, that attention-related areas attach timestamps to events by integrating different sources of information, including information from the same source active at different times, discounting sources according to the amount of noise and degree of unreliability in each signal. So, various things are happening in the brain, everything from processes that are going to initiate activity in pre-supplementary motor area to the proprioceptive activity after the button's been pressed. And so there are a whole bunch of signals here that can be used to try to attach a timestamp. But each signal, and on this idealization, there's this, this one area in frontal cortex, it would be a frontoparietal loop, which is sort of attending to what's happening. And there's a timestamp that's given as a function of all these different signals. But each of the signals has a noise term attached to it. It gets discounted according to, maybe how much variance there is in the firing rate, or things like that. So TMS on the pre-SMA increases noise in the later part of the readiness potential, lowering its weighting. Okay? Now this isn't specific yet to either the two reports, either the two shifts. The fact is that there's this one point at which the TMS is given. It's pre-SMA in the later part of the readiness potential, in the later part of its activity, lowering its weighting. Right? That is, lowering the reliability of that bit of the signal, maybe causing it to be almost ignored. Right? Okay, so how will that affect the two cases? Well, here's what they hypothesize, is that the report of the function, the report of the timing of the intention is a function of early and later activity in motor cortex, premotor cortex. If you introduce noise into the later activity, that gets discounted, and so earlier activity is given more weight. Right? If you have a number of witnesses and one of them gets disqualified, then you're going to have only information from the other witnesses to work with. In this case, we've got a temporal dimension to this. Earlier activity is supposed to correspond to earlier timestamp. So when the later activity in pre-SMA is zapped, then the earlier activity takes on additional weight. So I guess I should also make clear, these stages I've been talking about, sort of early activity in pre-SMA, late activity, later parts of the wave, that is the readiness potential, right? This is what the attention network is drawing its information from, not later things like visual awareness of the movement of the finger or proprioceptive awareness of the movement of the finger, right? Because they're being asked about the intention, not about the timing of the finger, right? So when they're trying to figure out when the intention occurred, they're sort of working with a set of materials, time course of events, such that the thing that's zapped is late in that time course of events. So their judgment then about the timing of the intention shifts to an earlier time. But the report of the action itself is a function of later activity in motor cortex together with confirmation of the action after execution by proprioception or vision. So if you introduce noise into the motor activity, introduce noise into the motor activity and later confirmation sources, visual verification, for example, are given more weight. Right? So what you've knocked out is, relative to the information that's used to make a decision about the timing of the action, what you're knocking out is earlier information. Right? So those judgments shift forward in time. Right? So that's pretty cool. Right? So you've got these two kind of overlapping time courses of data. You knock out the thing in the middle, and so with regard to this course of information, you've got to shift earlier in time. You're looking at it, yeah, earlier is to your left. And if you knock out this course of information with respect to, this bit of information with respect to this set, still said that wrong. Well, forget the visual aid. You knock out the earlier stuff, and you get increased emphasis on the later activity like visual confirmation, proprioceptive confirmation. All right, so does this have anything to do with manipulating the personal level? The report of conscious intention could be thought of as the output of personal level processing. A complex story might then be told about how the personal level states interact with the subpersonal states. But, I mean, why bother? After all, this stuff's not in the model. It's like I was recently at a conference and someone was talking about the subpersonal processes that give rise to the conscious experience, personal level conscious experience of bodily ownership. This is my arm, and those arms I see out there are not my arm, right? And the person was saying, well, these subpersonal processes explain the personal level of experience better than these other possible subpersonal processes. But I don't really have any account of how the subpersonal processes are supposed to sort of bubble up into or determine personal level experience. Some do, some don't. What's the principle? Why do some and not others? You get this kind of metaphysical puzzle, not that it's impossible to solve, but you get some serious questions here that you don't have to deal with if you just go flat. So why not say instead that a subpersonal representation of the event's timing controls the report, and it's part of a set of causally interacting states, calculating uncertainty, constructing a model, the timing of events, producing the finger movement, producing the button pressing, all at a single subpersonal level. I mean, that's what the model depicts. Anyway, so don't bother. I'll quickly give you a different example. This is part of what I'm trying to do is convince you that I'm not cherry picking. I didn't just grab that one paper and say, here's a case where it looks like you have a flat model of a psychologically interesting process. Many of you know that there's a growing literature on the behavioral effects of what are called implicit attitudes, with particular interest in implicit bias. For example, parade results, subjects will avow egalitarian attitudes toward members of other groups, or maybe the group that they're a member of as well. Even though his or her results on an implicit attitudes test suggest a negative attitude toward outgroup members. So typically, you take two groups, one which is thought to, be discriminated against, say, in society, right? Say black and white, and you construct this weird pattern of responses, kind of artificial, but you have disjunctive categories, right? You're supposed to respond with, say, the left finger, press one button, if you see on the screen either a black face or a positive word. And you're supposed to react with the right finger if you see either a white face or a negative word. Run those trials. Now switch the associations. It'll be press the button on the left if you see a black face or a negative word. Press the button on the right if you see a stereotypically white face or a positive word. Most subjects, reaction times go down in the second condition. That means they're faster. The idea is that means they associate good things with the members of the in-group and bad things with the members of the out-group. Right? And so that's one of the standard kind of implicit attitudes tests that's done. There are quite a few other experimental paradigms in the same kind of research area. And it's not all about, I should say, part of the reason I'm interested in this is because it's not all about sort of socially charged issues, really important socially charged issues. But it's also about kind of like more mundane psychological stuff. When people say they prefer fruit snacks to candy bars, does their kind of forced, fast, automatic response behavior, sort of hold up that judgment, or are they actually, if they have to pick very quickly in this forced situation, will they grab the candy bar over the apple, right? Experiments like this have been done with attitudes toward smoking as well. A variety of things. So here's the way this connects up with the personal-subpersonal talk. The avowed egalitarian attitudes are often thought of as personal level states, while the implicit states are thought of as subpersonal. And sometimes, this distinction may help some of you, sometimes this is also associated with the kind of system 1, system 2 distinction. The personal level states, the explicitly reported attitudes are, they're in system 2. Whereas the system 1 is the fast, automatic, subconscious sort of system, supposedly. And that's where these implicit attitudes are. But the farther along this literature has gotten, the greater the extent to which extant models incorporate interaction between the processes that produce these two kinds of outputs. As, however you think about these two processes, whether you like the system 1, system 2 talk or whatever, it doesn't look like you've got these two independent streams. Like I have explicit beliefs held at the personal level, and they produce verbal reports. And then I also have these implicit attitudes at the subpersonal level, and they control my fast automatic actions in the implicit attitudes test, or something like that. Right? It doesn't look like that. The results look a lot more like this. The key message is that implicit and explicit attitudes can interact in influencing behavior. This is from a paper by Marco Perugini, Predictive Models of Implicit and Explicit Attitudes. And here's he does a couple experiments in this paper. Here's a diagram he presents in connection with the results in study 2. And I think if there's a single thing in this talk that expresses the message I'm trying to get across, this is it. Maybe not as clearly as I'd like, but what you've got is a nice graphic depiction of the flatness. Right? There are explicit attitudes and there are implicit attitudes, and the implicit attitudes and the explicit attitudes are likely to combine to various degrees and various proportions to produce spontaneous behavior, the kind of thing that subjects are engaging in the implicit attitudes test when they're pressing the buttons as quickly as they can to categorize objects, faces, whatever. And when it comes to deliberative behavior, right? Someone asks you, how do you feel about such and such topic? And you think about it consciously. And, you know, that is also the output of a combination of contributions from explicit attitudes and implicit attitudes. And you know that maybe the explicit attitudes contribute more than the implicit attitudes when you ask someone to reflect on an issue and report their beliefs. Right? But there aren't these sort of two independent streams, one at a higher level than the other. With regard to any of these actions that I've talked about, or you know, everyday actions, I'm picking up a glass, I'm going to have a drink. There's a co-contribution of what we might think of as personal level states and, you know, sort of processes that are guided by the subconscious. And there's just no reason to put these at a different level. In fact, you'll be better able to model the co-contributions in some of the relations of inhibition as well. That's what this thing indicates, this line that runs between the implicit and explicit attitudes, like under what conditions does part of the processing stream, you know, shut down the competing one, you know, biased competition sort of picture. You'll be able to model these things in this nice flat framework, but the level disappears, the higher personal level thing disappears. So that's really all I want to say about this, but I'm going to again try to convince you that it's a robust point. Perugini's done well. He produces great work. But two of the towering figures in this literature on implicit attitudes are Bertrand Goransky and Galen Bodenhausen. And here they're the progenitors of the associative-propositional evaluation model, the APE model. And here they are saying something like Perugini said 2 slides back. Right? By making specific assumptions about mutual interactions between associative, read subpersonal, and propositional, read personal, processes, right? The APE model implies a wide range of predictions about the conditions under which implicit and explicit evaluations show either converging or diverging patterns of responses. And they go into some detail in the paper, too, talking about the ways in which, say, the consideration of propositional, like relations between propositions and working memory, is going to have to sort of work together with what we think of as subpersonal processes to test for consistency or to maintain these things in awareness. And so you've got, and there's no reason, again, to think of this as a levels distinction. It's just there's a mechanism that works together with the short-term memory buffer to carry out this process of propositional evaluation. And so part of the point I'm making here is, it's put it narrowly, you might think the behavior that we might be inclined to think of as the output of the personal level is always being determined partly by subpersonal processes that are running alongside. All right, so conclusion, I think the psychological or cognitive realm is flat, at least insofar as there's no distinct personal level. Some people have argued that sort of once you dig into the engineering stuff, as it might be called, there are levels. there are at least parts and wholes levels. I don't know if they're metaphysical levels, but I think there's a kind of ambiguity here in the levels talk. Some psychological or cognitive states are closely associated with what might be called person-related phenomena. Maybe these are, for example, subpersonal representations of the self. You might have very kind of rich, detailed personal biography, and that's, I'm not trying to take that away from you. It's in there. It's just encoded subpersonally or somehow recorded subpersonally and guides various forms of behavior, such as telling your narrative to others. But they don't appear at a distinct higher level in relation to subpersonal states and processes. So I'll leave things there.
Yeah, so we have lots of time for questions.
I think I began to lose the big picture when you got onto implicit bias. The message appeared to be that the implicit bias would be carried by the subpersonal level, by whatever's going on,
Yep.
fair enough. But mustn't it also be part of this picture that the unbiased, deliberative conscious doings would also have their own subpersonal goings-on underlying them?
Yes. So I don't want to deny, this was a part of the import of one of the last remarks I made, I don't want to deny that that will often in modeling will black box some things. We'll talk about less specific properties as more coarse-grained properties of a system or a portion of a system rather than more fine-grained properties. But I'm not sure that we want to think of this as a levels distinction. So I might have so let's have explicit beliefs, implicit attitudes. Right? They're both contributing to some behavior. Right? But the thought is that the explicit beliefs are just kind of more properties at that same level. And either, to go back to your question, either those properties can be unpacked. So we say explicit belief, but what we're really talking about is a much more complicated sort of structure. Right? Either those can be unpacked, and we find out sort of what explicit beliefs really are when we get to the details, or we don't need to unpack them necessarily, but they are interacting with other causal processes that we would think of as subpersonal. That's kind of what I had in mind when I was thinking about attention-related mechanisms keeping information active in short-term memory when evaluating propositions. Right? So it might be it's going to be a messy process in there, but I don't see a reason here to take the explicit beliefs as having kind of subpersonal realizers, which then creates a level for the explicit beliefs that doesn't appear when we're talking about other aspects of the cognitive system. Does that make sense? Okay.
Yeah, so I was trying to distinguish one kind of criticism from another. Maybe they're just really closely related. One would just be to say, let's say we read Tyler and we have this list of a priori claims about states that we attribute to individuals. And one claim is we shouldn't take giving us account of those states as a criteria of adequacy for a cognitive science theory. That's just not an appropriate target. That's not something we're aiming for. That's not what our models are designed to capture.
Mm-hmm.
But that seems to be independent from the question of whether there's a levels picture involved. This is more related to your last point. I mean, I was sort of wondering throughout, like, how flat does it really have to be? So I could just say, I'm not interested in all of these features of mental states that philosophers have thought were true a priori, and I could still have a lot of levels going on. It's just that none of them satisfy the features that Tyler thought were a priori, right? So it seems like there's a separate claim about what cognitive science ought to be doing, and then I guess, in some sense I'm saying that the personal level we might get rid of, but we could still have a levels picture that wouldn't be entirely flat.
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of work to be done in this sort of particular area of kind of general philosophy of cognitive science to sort of understand what's going on when you have more fine-grained properties, more coarse-grained properties, as well as properties of portions of a system or of a larger system, the system as a whole maybe. So it's interesting to ask what properties a network has in processing some data as a whole, right? But some of those properties, if you're trying to understand them, might lead you to look at sort of subportions and the way they're connected to each other, right? Or not, right? And so you're like, oh yeah, I'm interested in a property of the whole, and I'm interested in the properties of the parts. I'm interested in the way the property of the whole is related to the property of the parts. Is that a levels distinction? I don't think so. Because part of the reason I don't think so is because then we just have levels all over the place, right? And so that's kind of reductio of the usefulness of the concept, I think. But it's not to say that we shouldn't be looking at kind of network dynamics as a whole, or properties of whole organisms versus properties of their parts. I think that's all pretty interesting. I think while that stuff, those issues need to be sorted out, I think the connection between like Burge's list and this somewhat mysterious personal level that I'm trying to get rid of, right? That the reason it's so kind of levels infused in a distinctive way is tied to the epistemology of it, the fact that it's generated a priori. Why would anyone think that there's a priori access to this? I think a standard story is then going to introduce this personal level, this separate level, in order to explain the epistemology of these claims. Right? Yeah.
Well, I have a question.
Shoot.
As you know, I taught psychology for many years.
Mm-hmm.
There's an interesting sort of bifurcation in the intro to psychology textbook market. There's a subset of textbooks that are titled some things like The Science of Behavior, and they understand and integrate psychological results under that framework. And then there's another subset of textbooks that are titled things like The Science of Experience, right? And there are particular differences in the way they understand the literatures that they're reporting on.
Mm-hmm.
Is one upshot of this argument that second set of textbook authors are confused about their own science?
Probably not,
Okay.
because often when, in my experience, is that when cognitive scientists talk about experience, they don't have anything so robust in mind. Right? So think about theories.
Like Wundt certainly did.
Well,
I mean, that's the old school.
Yeah, he wasn't a cognitive scientist, but okay, fair enough. But you think about things like a global workspace model of consciousness. The simple version of this is that there's a shared workspace. You can think of it just in terms of kind of boxes and arrows. There are input modules, typically like sensory systems, right, which each kind of run on their own, and then they deliver their outputs into this workspace. It's like a blackboard out in the hallway. Each of us comes out of our office and writes the results of our thought processes on this blackboard. And when we go out to write on the blackboard, we can see what other people have written, and we can use that to go back to our office and think some more. Right? So you've got input modules into the shared workspace. Each of the people in my example are modules, so to speak. If I really want these two metaphors to line up, I guess other people should be using what's on the blackboard, but that other group of people would be like the output modules, or the things that are done, language production or motor control or something like that. So there are a whole bunch of kind of dedicated input processes that run independently of each other. There are a whole bunch of dedicated output processes that run independently of each other. The information that the output processes can use to do their thing, guide their like decisions or operation, that information comes from this shared workspace that any one of those output systems can get access to. And that information comes from these input systems that really don't communicate with each other, but they all dump their results into this shared workspace. Okay, great. And what's a conscious state? A conscious state is a state in the global workspace. That's what consciousness is. Right? So here's a theory of experience, you may think, and that, but then you compare that with what philosophers who think there is a personal level would say. Maybe the most well-known philosopher of consciousness who talked about this stuff is David Chalmers, and in his famous book, he dismisses this kind of work on consciousness early on and says, that's not a theory of what we really want, a theory of experience, because experience has these phenomenal properties that can't be explained by just causes and effects and that sort of thing. But for the purpose of a kind of cognitive scientific theory of consciousness, you've got what you need there, right, in the boxes and arrows, and it's all at the same level, right? The shared workspace isn't at a different level from the input modules or the output modules, and so why sort of introduce more? And I have to look at particular examples when you think about the textbook on explaining experience. Sometimes I think there are psychologists who aren't really, how should I put this, maybe aren't cognitive scientists, right? Because one thing I take to be distinctive of cognitive science is this attempt to tell a mechanistic story, is to do the modeling in a way that will be at least potentially fleshed out eventually at the neural level or whatever other kind of materialistic level we stop at. So, I think if a psychologist says, hey, there's just human experience, and what I want to do is somehow explain those processes in the mind, but I'm not going to cache those out. I'm not even going to try to cache those out mechanistically or find the mechanisms that, the operation of which really amounts to those experiences. Right? But then they're not doing cognitive science as far as I can tell. Right? So, one way to think about this is to think about Mars 3 levels. I think it's implicit going back for decades before Mars book came out in the work of like Newell and Simon, and lots of others. So, you've got a level where you're just kind of thinking about what it would be useful for the organism to do, and then you've got a level where you're actually going to, so to speak, write the program that allows the organism to do it, and then you're going to find the machinery that implements that program. That's paradigmatic cognitive scientific inquiry, and I'm not sure whether that's showing up in the textbooks on experience. Yeah. When it comes to the experience itself.
This is interesting because I think it makes this story something like historically contingent. Because
the labels.
The labels.
Yeah.
Right? Because I think there probably were, say, in the 50s, classic cognitive psychology might have been something more like trying to explain things at the personal level. And I think, there are still some of those folks working in it now, but I think mostly that's given way to what you're characterizing as cognitive science.
Yeah, I think that's right.
That's an interesting historical. I think that might be an interesting historical point, sort of the death of the person in psychology.
Yeah.
Psyche.
The psyche. This is kind of what's striking in the discovery of the computer and how it's connected to the rise of cognitive science. I think for the sort of first time we had a kind of mechanistic story. Babbage and other people had tried to work this out, but we had what looked like a general mechanistic story about how these behaviors we normally talked about at the personal level could be implemented, right? Proving theorems is a matter of insight, right? You might think, actually it's a matter of having a program that runs through, the search of space of possible moves in this particular way. And Newell and Simon got a lot of attention for doing this. Part of what made Chomsky's contribution so sort of interesting and influential was not just the sort of negative things he said about Skinner and the behaviorists. They couldn't explain this or they couldn't explain that. It was that there was also this kind of mechanistic story, the generative grammar story that was being told in a positive way about how language is produced. There's a set of actual representation of the grammar, and then there's some computational crunching, which leads you to recognize the structure of input or produce well-formed output, and I think so. I think that the history of cognitive science. I guess I'm struggling a little bit with the idea that it's contingent. It's contingent that people came up with computers the way they did. It's contingent that there was this bit of progress, but I think it represents really genuine progress. You might talk about people's memory behavior and why people can remember lots of things under some circumstances and not so much under other conditions. But you don't, it's kind of a wholly descriptive story until someone like Miller comes along and says, no, this is how chunking would work. Here's how you get a bunch of bits of information into 4 or 5 symbols, right? In binary code, whatever. And so I think that's the great sort of innovation of cognitive science. And then you get better and better tools for looking at the brain and trying to figure out how these things relate to each other. And, yeah.
So your version of flattening things, I find very interesting. But I'd like to know whether I understand it well.
Okay.
So there's a version of flattening things that is just reducing to the sublevel. There's one level that's just merging whatever, sometimes you don't need that. interesting in the sense that, well, if you forget about maybe the personal level, when you start looking at maybe behaviors or features of things, properties, things that interact, and then it can open up the possibility for looking for interactions that are outside the personal level as well, not just inside. So it's really just understanding the network of interactions and what might be causing what.
Yep.
Am I right?
Yes.
So in this case, there's no reductionism. It's just like getting rid of certain boxes that we've created.
Yeah, and there are a few dimensions to this, I think, that are maybe worth remarking on. So one is that it opens up, not that I particularly want to go there, but I think it's important that it opens up a path to a more extended view, distributed view of cognition and mind. Because then the question is like, okay, what are the sets of causes responsible for producing different kinds of behavior? Some of those causes might be outside the brain, outside the body, and that sort of thing. And then, we have a kind of legitimate task of trying to figure out whether there's, some of these causes cluster together more tightly and maybe make up the core cognitive system, and then whether that occurs in here or whether part of that's even outside. I'm going to talk about that on Friday, actually, if anybody wants to. The trick, I think, for a lot of people, or a stumbling block for a lot of people, is to think of this as a kind of eliminativism. I give this talk and people say, but there's no consciousness and there are no beliefs and that kind of thing. But I've tried to make it clear that that's not where this is headed. It could head there, we just don't know. The idea is that you do the modeling and see what comes out of it. Right? And there might be states that are similar enough to how folks had thought about belief in their everyday lives. So there might be beliefs that are found at the flat level. So in that picture, I said that diagram from Perugini was maybe the best representation of what I was trying to get across, because in that picture you've got explicit beliefs. Well, you've got explicit attitudes, which are normally associated with beliefs. Right? And so it's not, like I say, it could lead to eliminativism, but that's not the goal at all. It's just that when we make a list, when philosophers of mind are thinking about the mind a priori, or trying to derive truths about the mind from common sense, maybe regimented a bit, when philosophers of mind are doing this, they're leaving out lots of the other causes that modulate the effects or the contributions of those states. Right? And those things are running sort of in parallel, and they're modulating each other, and they're contributing to the production of the behavior. So there's no sort of pure stream of the folk psychological truths or the personal level truths that you can kind of investigate independently of this stuff. And to the extent that you find patterns holding between explicit states that look kind of like belief-desire explanations, then you found a kind of belief-desire explanation at the subpersonal level. But the states are going to be different. I want to be honest about that. Almost certainly going to be different from the beliefs and desires as many philosophers of mind think of them. Right. So when they think of desires and they think of preferences, and a rationally coherent being can't have intransitive preferences, and they can't have contradictory beliefs. And when you start doing the kind of modeling I'm talking about, it's much more likely that even if we do find beliefs or desires, or preferences down there, they're probably going to differ in some of these ways. There will be more possibility of follow-up. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure that anybody doing rational choice models, whether applying them in economics or game theory or whatever, has ever said that there is any agent who actually is perfectly consistent.
Yeah.
It's a normative thing through and through.
Yeah, and I think it's more common for philosophers to say this kind of stuff. It's to think that what that normative claim is, you think of it this way, to the extent that we are persons, it's the extent to which we approximate that norm. Right? So,
Gee, I mean, look, if you think of transitivity of preference, this is there are so many things. Nobody, when Chomsky and when they were showing that real agents are violating these things all over the place. Nobody thought that they certainly thought that it made problems for people that tried to build too much rationality in, and that we had to think more carefully about it. But I mean, even Savage in his book makes very clear that it's that you're it's not the fundamental causal story.
Yeah, I agree, and this is the kind of point, I think I was trying to make a point in this vicinity when I talked about Griffith's work. This sort of idea that thinking of us as ideal Bayesian reasoners can sort of help guide the research program toward what might be productive models, useful models. But those models, when you go to tell the causal story, they're not going to be models that respect ideal reasoning, right? And Griffiths knows this. And so it's not that like sort of thinking about normativity can't be productive, right? Thinking about normativity can be productive, but thinking that the states have this property of being normative that puts them in a different kind of realm or involves them in a whole different kind of explanation, that's a philosophical move that I'm trying to sort of neutralize.
I'm trying to think of whoever made that move. I can't think of anyone.
Well, so think of...
Okay, maybe... no,
maybe philosophers. It might just be philosophers. I mean, then that would be part of my point, is that this is a kind of philosophical fiction, that there's this level, and that's what cognitive science is all about. People, influential philosophers such as Donald Davidson would make this point that there's a difference between action and mere behavior, right? If I have a sore shoulder and it just kind of, this isn't very realistic, but it just kind of makes my arm fly up, right? That's mere behavior, right? But an action has a purpose, there's an intention behind it, a belief-desire pair that produce the intention. It's to signal, like to get somebody's attention, or to wave to someone, right? And that's real action because there's an intelligible kind of belief-desire explanation of what produced it. And this kind of distinction gets reified in this levels talk. And it really has been influential in philosophy. Part of what bothers me about it is that it's often a way to try to avoid objections to one's view, right? So people say, this is how the mind works. Philosophers will say this. This is how the mind works. And I thought about it really hard in my armchair, and this is how the mind works. And someone else will come along and say, but in Mark Hallett's lab over here at the NIH, they've been doing these experiments, and it really doesn't seem to work that way. And the philosopher will say, that's the subpersonal story. I'm talking about the personal level. It's a kind of shield against.
That step, the last one you just said, that I have trouble seeing examples of a philosopher actually making it that way. I'm not even sure Taylor Burge makes it that way.
Well, send me an email. I'll give you some examples.
Okay.
Yeah. I've been tracking some of these.
Your first pass is very inflammatory. It's a conclusion. You went through your examples and then said, flatten it all out. Okay. I sort of read you in a slightly more generous kind of way, saying, look out, it may be flat, get used to it.
Yeah.
I just want to back up what you said. One of the most infamous targets, I think, for your qualifications here would be, say, Bennett's and Hackert's book on neuroscience and philosophy, I forget the exact title, in which they legislate on a priori grounds
Yeah.
and the notion of the consequences of conceptual truths about beliefs that indicate that we have this kind of level of commitment to person-based psychology. So it really is out there, and actually, to great avoirdupois, I actually have a copy in my bag that I don't want to lift because it's so heavy.
Yeah.
If I might, I'd just like to go back to your first example and ask you a question.
Mm-hmm.
The causal factors that set out the differences are time-stamping, I think. That is, an earlier timestamp or a later timestamp depending upon some function of noise in the respective contexts. But the question then is, who does the reading? There's got to be a timestamp reader, one presumes. What comes to mind is, say, Dennett giving this characteristic picturesque image of these sorts of things, saying, think of getting a letter from a distant place and it's got the date at the top of the letter, so the message is flagged with time. That by itself is really independent of the temporal order in which the thing appears through the mailbox. And the questions that of course come about date stamping versus the presentations of consciousness. Okay, but even so, actually your point need only be that even if you have to have a timestamp reader, it's not at all obvious that the timestamp reader itself has to be linked with, shall we say, full-blown consciousness, agency, rationality, point of view, and normative components. I'm just reading back to all this.
Yeah, that's right. Yep.
And that's got to be an open empirical question about whether the level of the connection to the timestamp reading is really engaged in a system which is a nexus for the intersection of all those factors that might plausibly then be called a kind of personhood. You know, the Lau et al. Paper, I presume, doesn't really sort of say anything about that. Why should it? And what you've done is to highlight the fact that there is a, you know, in this causal explanation, there's a delineation of the operative differences between one causal scenario and another, you know, with cause, without cause, and so on. And very often, actually, successful explanations like that don't even require a full enumeration of all the values of all the contextual factors which are unchanging. So you don't even have to have an explicit theory of personhood or full-blown timestamp reading plus in order to say this is the nexus of causal differences that will be the explanation of this phenomenon. Just to add one last thing, there's a fantastic article by Ian Hacking about microscopy in the 19th century when people didn't understand that very high-grade microscopes worked by the summation of varying orders of diffraction. They weren't just simply ray optical or simple optical devices. They were very sophisticated devices that nobody had any really material idea about what was going on. And yet they were perfectly able to set out differences in cellular structure by looking at the differences in one and another sample, even in the ignorance of what the instrument was kind of based in. That is, what causal factors make the microscopes possible to kind of suppress. So by analogy, I would say, you know, all that person put stuff, you can just say, leave that alone, put that in the categories paribus, the operative causal factors and their ties to the explanandum of interest here are identified in a delimited kind of way and perfectly successfully.
Yeah, so I wasn't entirely explicit about my larger methodological commitments. It may have been clear from the content of the talk. I'm a naturalist. I have an expansive conception of what the methods of the sciences are, right? So, you know, when Quine says philosophy of science is philosophy enough, that's fine so long as philosophy of science is understood broadly enough, as include lots of various forms of theorizing and whatnot. And so this raises a couple of interesting questions. I think one is about revisability. And you were making this point that there's a difference between saying there's no personal level and saying what I sometimes said is we just don't have any reason to believe in it right now. But as a naturalist, of course, I have to leave open this possibility that as cognitive science progresses, or whatever its descendant sciences progresses, it might turn out that in the best models there's such a distinction between two kinds of elements, right, that we really should think of them as being as appearing at different levels. I don't know exactly what this amounts to. I can't predict, right? I don't think it would just be being a nexus for a lot of information, though. That was part of the point of my working through the global workspace model, is to say, I don't think, qua naturalists and just sort of reading the contemporary literature in cognitive science, I don't think there's a Cartesian theater of the sort that Dennett criticizes. There's not a little person in there watching all the, the stuff parade by the mind, right? And there's not absolute timing of events and all that sort of things that would go along with that. But there may well be sort of nexuses of responsibility in the causal sense, just where, various people, Cole, Antonio Damasio, think, it's worth sort of thinking about parts of the cognitive system as they're neurally implemented as having kind of hubs that have a special kind of control and executive function or a special kind of control in like integrating information from different parts of the brain and parts of the cognitive system. And that's one kind of modeling. But having that turn into a two levels model is something I can't exactly anticipate, but I have to leave open the possibility of it. Yeah, that's right.
One question, announcement I forgot to make when we started. This obviously is being taped. If you asked a question, you were likely on that tape. If you'd rather not be on that tape, when it goes public, please just tell Greg on the way out, and he'll edit that out before it gets uploaded.
Can I add something before the tape?
You have a small business?
If you're not arguing for eliminatism, really,
Yeah.
so it seems like in the end of the day, that's kind of where you think it's going to go. I'd like to understand better what your sense is of what's going on in psychiatry and medicine, where we really can't do the job if we don't make a clear distinction between the personal and subpersonal level.
So maybe you could say a little bit more about that last part. Why do you think you can't do the job without making that distinction?
It's hard to say that briefly. My sense is that medicine requires an objective distinction between the reality of the individual experience and what medicine perceives from the outside. If it didn't see a sharp line there, if the patient says, it still hurts, but all the doctor's tests say nothing's wrong there, then you would just go home, right? But it's because the patient says, yeah, but it still hurts, that, and the doctor recognizes that level as being, different and relevant.
Yep. But it needn't be at a different level, I guess, is what I was trying to sort of probe for. So there's at least the following kind of subpersonal state, the state that produces the report from the patient that they still feel pain, right? And so the doctor wants to causally intervene to make that report go away, and some other reports come out. That's a really minimal reading, but that's possible.
I think the doctor doesn't care about the report. The doctor cares about the experience.
Well, the report is correlated with other things, with other states. There's the state that produced the report probably isn't just, doing something all by itself. It looks like, this literature is a little bit controversial in some ways or upsetting to some people, but it looks like in some of these cases where you can't find, physiological counterparts to pain as we normally think of them, in chronic pain sufferers, it's what may be operative is that the patients have made being in pain part of their sort of self-identity, right? And that is itself a subpersonal act, I would say. That is where your identity is stored, the narrative is stored, you keep the story about yourself. That's just as subpersonal as the language parsing system or the face recognition system, and they're all just sort of running alongside each other. And when somebody has a narrative, I'm the kind of person who's in pain all the time, right? This can have effects because it's just cause and effect at the physical level, or and so sorry, I'm rattling.
Sorry, I'll let it go. But I think that in medicine, that's actually my area of expertise. Is that
Yeah.
So in medicine, that distinction, that explanation is distinguished from your body did it in a very definitive and sharp way. That really does seem to require the reality of the personal level. That's what I'm suggesting.
Yeah. So it might be that method requires. I mean, coincidentally, I'm living right now with my daughter and son-in-law. She's a medical resident, and I hear lots of stories from day-to-day life. I have a grandchild, and so I'm hanging out and spending time with the grandchild, and I, there's too much going on. There are too many patients coming through. There are too many, charts that need to be updated. So there's a lot of black boxing going on. There's a lot of using the resources that are available. And some of the resources that are available to interact with patients are our everyday resources for interacting with each other. And those resources look like we're interacting as persons at a higher level. In fact, that's what inspires lots of these philosophers to introduce the idea. And I guess I'm pushing back and saying, yeah, that's a convenient way to interact with people. It may get a lot done in medicine and law and teaching philosophy and all sorts of other stuff, but doesn't necessarily correspond to the cognitive reality of it. What's going on in my mind when a student comes to my office and has a problem? My model of that student and their problem may be, if I had access to it, it may really look like a model that has two levels, personal and subpersonal. But whether that corresponds to reality is another question, right? So lots of time, there are useful fictions in a lot of cases. And I think this might be a useful fiction, but yeah.
Time for one more?
So it sounds like kind of lurking here, or maybe this is just something I'm adding on top of what you're saying. It sounds like, or I want to say now, after hearing this, that a lot of the sort of intention talk, or a lot of the belief desire talk, is just kind of nothing more than an over-description.
Here's a positive way to kind of interpret the success of belief desire talk, is to say, look, those states are in there at the subpersonal level. I'm not pushing for eliminativism, whether as a side comment, whether this kind of view, it tends toward eliminativism or not, depends on how much you emphasize the kind of conceptual stuff that Bennett and Hacker do, and that kind of thing. If you have a really robust idea of what, the definition of a whale is, whales are fish, they're of the same kind as those little things swimming around over there, then it turns out there are no whales, right? And so you're an eliminativist if you're really committed to a certain understanding of whales. So if you're really strict in laying down a bunch of conditions on beliefs, then yeah, my view is probably going to lead to eliminativism. But if you have a kind of, I think, a more realistic view about the kind of evolution of human categorization and science and that kind of stuff, where there's lots of revision as we go along, then I think we may well find beliefs in there at the subpersonal level. Okay, so that was kind of the aside. But what about this kind of optimistic view of belief, desire, explanation? The optimistic view is that there is a significant range of cases in which we capture most of the variance in behavior by talking only about the belief and desire states. So there might be lots of other stuff happening, but it's not contributing in a significant enough way to bother including it in the causal explanation. Okay? And that could be. I don't want to prejudge that issue because it looks like we've been wrong in lots of cases about how our minds work and what's responsible for our behavior in lots of cases in the past. This might be more personal history than you need, but I think the first psych paper I ever read was Nisbet and Wilson's 1977 piece in Psych Review when I was 20 years old or something. And it was called Telling More Than We Can Know, Verbal Reports on Mental Processes, I think is the full title. And I recommend it to everyone. It's an awesome paper. And it seemed like it took decades for philosophers mostly to catch on to this and say, wow, people aren't very good at introspection or reporting on how their own cognitive processes work. But by the time they published that paper in 77, there had been a good 20 years of robust results in experimental research. And eventually, John Doris and Steve Stitch and a bunch of other people kind of got onto this stuff. Stitch maybe earlier than most, but so the suspicion there is that we might think belief, desire, explanation will capture a lot of the variance in behavior. I think we're likely to be wrong about that. So if the beliefs and desires are contributing, but they're contributing alongside a lots of other stuff that's important causally with respect to behavior, then we shouldn't be lionizing belief, desire, explanation, acting as if it's something we can kind of extract out of the picture and reason about a priori. And that's another way of saying stop doing this personal level stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. In the description of the experiments with the delay, the TMS,
Mm-hmm.
it looks like the patient report or the subject report of their intention.
Mm-hmm.
That's what to me it was like. That looks like they're over describing what actually is going on, and that's just an additional processing or something like that.
Mm-hmm. I think there are unanswered questions about why we report having intentions at a particular time. It might be a useful part of constructing this narrative. And the narrative itself might have more uses than I think really have been discussed much in the literature. Dennett is famous for hypothesizing that this personal narrative plays a kind of, well, he calls it the role of a public relations department. It's kind of a cynical hypothesis, right? Why do I keep a kind of running story about who I am and how I behave and where I've been and that kind of stuff? It's to smooth things over with other people when I behave badly or something like that. It's to put a positive spin on my actions that are really driven by something else, like survival, interest in resources and that kind of stuff. So, and that he may be right about that up to a point, but it may be that this narrative plays a role in like some fairly boring computational processes, like it helps make search more manageable in various ways. And so, I think there's a whole lot of stuff that it's worth exploring. Now, it might be that the subject's over-describing, that the subject learned this word intention, and it's stored in their mentally represented lexicon, and when the frontoparietal network assigns a timestamp to the thing that caused the movement, that's rigged up to the resources involved in verbal report, and so the subject says, intention then, right? Now, maybe we don't need that label. Maybe some of the work that the narrative does is not best thought of as a narrative, because we think of narrative as a linguistic entity, right? It's some kind of model of the self that can be tuned in response to correct feedback on guesses about timing of actions and things. And none of this has to be sort of put linguistically, so it might be that our practice of talking about this as intentions is really over description or not useful description. But I think that remains to be seen. Yeah.